Hi everybody. In this clip, what we're going to be doing is blocking in some of our basic design principles for our shovel sword. So, we're in Photoshop right now, and we're going to make a new document. The size of it doesn't necessarily matter. We'll go 2500 by 1500. We could always change this at any point, so it's not really a big deal. Our color mode will be RGB because it's easier to work with, but we can change all these at any point. So, I'm in Photoshop, I've got my document, and I basically just want to start blocking in the basic ideas here of what I'm trying to work with. So first off, I got to understand what is the structure of a shovel. So again, the structure of a shovel, pretty easy. Big basic shape, spade element towards the top, potentially long handle, with a bit of a triangle again at the bottom. But that's basically it. There's really not a lot more complexity to this. Now, if we want a sword, we've got a hilt, we've got a handle, usually much shorter than what we would have for the shovel, and a blade that's really thin compared to the shovel, and much, much longer in general, and something like that. Now, of course, these can be a lot more, complex in a lot of situations, but for the most part, this is all that really needs to be covered. These are the big basic shapes. The important thing to understand is these are not interesting designs for either of these objects. They are the most generic, obvious silhouette shape for either of these pieces. So when you see this, for example, you immediately understand that that is a shovel. It's very clear. It may be maybe another piece of farming equipment or something like that, but for the most part, you're going to guess it's a shovel. And here, we've got what is pretty clearly a sword. There's not really too much questioning about what the object is going to be because the silhouette tells us that information. Now, basically what we want to do in this process is figure out how we can combine those two shapes with each other. So, for example, if I were to just copy this piece and copy this piece, let's just take a little bit more off the top there, and just stick them together, what do we have? Well, we've got this kind of interesting object. It's not necessarily a shovel, it's not really a sword, it's kind of an amalgam between the two. Now, how can we start to make this look a little bit more like a shovel? Because right now this is maybe a dagger or just like a weird shape. Well, if we start combining some other elements here, such as this, then we start to get something that's relatively obvious, but because we're combining these two disparate objects, we need to be a little bit more careful with exactly what we're doing in here, because it won't necessarily be obvious right away. So you have to start using a little bit more of that design language. Most of the shapes that we were dealing with when it comes to these shovels have a little tapered section in the center, which sort of connects the shovel part, the handle, to the rest of it. And the sword elements could end up being a little bit more sword-like in this case. So what this means is that our thumbnail process may need to be a little bit more thoughtful sometimes. So we could do this. Let's make this handle part just even bigger in this case, so that we're really kind of hammering home what we're dealing with here. Now this starts to look a little bit more like a sword, but maybe we extend this section. But let's try this as something else, because the fact of the matter is, as we're dealing with this, we always want to try alternate variations on this same kind of idea. When it comes to thumbnailing, you don't want to spend too long with a single drawing. If you want to know more about the thumbnailing process, please check out my previous course, Game Prop Concept Fundamentals. In that, we're going to be covering the thumbnail process in much more detail, but for the most part, understand that thumbnails are just quick drawings for us to kind of get a lot of ideas out on paper. So, for example, here, if I really wanted to make this look like a sword, I might think, okay, well, let's pull out the blade section here, redraw some of that, and see how that looks. That starts to look more like a sword, but we are really losing a lot of that shovel kind of element to this. Now again, when you start to look at more reference of what these objects are, you'll start to understand what things repeat in there other than silhouette. Because the silhouettes between these two, pretty similar otherwise. And even in some cases, they have directly similar elements. So there's a few other differences in here that we won't necessarily understand. So for example, the actual structure of a shovel is quite a bit different. So for example, the handle will tend to tilt down a little bit and then do, let's just erase that part there. It's a bit of a complicated shape. There we go. Let's do something like this, and it tends to taper in like this. That's the general structure of shovels. It can differ in many situations, so that it'll be a little bit different than this. That structure may not work for a sword, but we may need some of it to make sure that it doesn't just necessarily look like a blade. So if I show you a sword from the side, a structure for something like this is going to look something along these lines. And that stays straight the whole time. That's just absolutely necessary. If I wanted this to look more like a shovel, I might have to start tapering the design out a little bit. So for example, I'm just going to take this section, move it down like this, maybe try to pull that out. At this point, it's worthwhile to kind of explore these options when you're trying to work through your thumbnail process. What can you get away with in your design to have this still read like a sword, but not necessarily lose the shovel elements so that it looks like a combination of both? Some design elements work better than others. If this sword was tapering out, it would have a very weird shape to it. If we look at it from the side, it would kind of taper down like that. So here's the hilt here, maybe that diamond part at the bottom, and the blade would be like this. That can work, but may look really, really strange. So probably not where I want to go with this. Let's take that out as well. But again, we want to keep in mind some of those structural elements. One of the things that I really like with some of the handles as well that I was seeing is that they've got this sort of bolt connection to it. And then they've got a shovel section up here, big taper. Sometimes this section here as well is really sharp, like far out, or much more shallow. Those kind of things will change the way this looks. So of course, in situations like this, if we wanted to make this look a little bit more shovel-like, then we could taper that a little bit more. Maybe even extend some sections like this so that they take up more of that information there, and start to include more shovel elements here, like bolts, to just kind of really emphasize that shape of shovel as much as possible. But again here, let's just try to use a little bit of that shape. This part can tend to be maybe a little bit softer in nature, not quite as sharp of a shape. And then for the base of it, it can tend to have another little bit of a section here, a couple bolts, and then start to have that handle at the end. Now, the shape of the handle can also differ from reference to reference. Sometimes it's one full uniform piece of wood, which can be super useful. It can also be, in some cases, a different variation on that. Sometimes, let's just take this out here. Sometimes it can be something like this, where the whole piece here is just connected at the base. This is one of the more common ones. One of the ones that I also like, let's just change that color. There we go. Duplicate. One of the ones that I also like seeing is right in here, is ones that tend to have just a totally straight bar across the bottom. This metal piece usually connects like that, and you just get this metal section at the bottom. These all tend to change the shape of it, but the main thing we want to keep in mind is what that general structure is. So we've got blade, or the actual shovel section. We've got a hilt that can be of various lengths, and we've got the handle that can be of various structures, and lastly the hilt. So the handle, the length of it will make it look more like a shovel or more like a sword, depending on the length. The blade, the length of it will also change how much of a sword or shovel it looks like. The hilt will definitely, depending on its importance, will change how much of a sword it looks like, and the handle kind of feels like a piece that is almost uniformly useful for us, because it will always key us back towards shovel. No matter what, it's the one thing that a sword does not have. So the more we lean into that shovel handle element, the more we're going to be able to make sure that people are going to think shovel when they see this. We'll just go through a few more thumbnails to start experimenting with different shapes and proportions of our design.